Welcome back, friends. I am Surbhi Unyal and I teach philosophy at Hansraj College, University of Delhi. We are doing a special lecture series on Introduction to Philosophy, and in that we are doing Nyāya Philosophy. In our last lectures, we discussed Nyāya epistemology, where we discussed perception, and in our previous lecture, we started with talking about Nyāya inference. Continuing with our discussion on inference as per Nyāyikas, we were talking about the 5 members that are required in the Nyāya Syllogism. So Nyāya, as we discussed, talked about 2 types of inference, which is inference for oneself and the inference for the other. And we discussed that it is the inference for the other or Partha Anuman where we require these 5 members of syllogism to be stated in language. That means verbally you need to discuss all these 5 members to make the other person convinced of the relationship that you are trying to establish here between what is unperceived by relating it to what has been perceived earlier. So continuing with that, the 5 members in Nyāya Syllogism, the first is pratigya or the proposition, and this basically is the logical statement which has to be proved. Then comes the reason, which states the reason for the establishment of the proposition that one is trying to make. So the first is pratigya or the proposition, and on the then we have reason to establish that proposition. Then comes udharan. Udharan means giving an example of the to establish the proposition that one is uttering. The fourth is upanay or the application of the universal concomitants to the present case. Here we show its application and show the application of the universal concomitants relating it to the present case. The fifth is nigaman or conclusion, which is drawn from the preceding propositions. And these 5 propositions of Indian syllogism are called members or avyayas. So let us try to understand these by taking the classical example of smoke and fire. So here what you want to establish or your proposition is that this hill has fire. So you want to establish this. This is your pratigya. How do you do that? Why do you say that this hill has fire? Based on the hetu, which is the reason. And you say that because it has smoke. So because it has smoke is the reason for you to say that the hill has fire. The third is whatever has smoke has fire. For example, in the kitchen. So that is the udaharan. So you are giving an example for establishing your proposition that this hill has fire because it has smoke, and the example that you are giving is that whatever has smoke has fire. For example, you have seen in the kitchen. Then you are showing its application. So you are saying that this hill has smoke, which is invariably associated with fire. And then on the basis of these premises, you are then establishing a conclusion or a nigaman, which is that therefore this hill has fire. Fine. So your proposition was that this hill has fire. Then you utter a reason that why do you say that? Because it has smoke. Then you give an example that whatever has smoke has fire, like in the case of kitchen. Then you say, how is that applicable here? That this hill has smoke, which is invariably related to fire. Therefore, this hill has fire. Now let us compare this Nyāya syllogism with Aristotelian syllogism. So Aristotelian syllogism has only 3 propositions. We notice that Nyāya Philosophy aligns with the Barbara, which is the AAA mood of the first figure in Aristotelian logic. And that is known as the strongest mood in the strongest figure. So although Nyāya Philosophy has 5 propositions, both systems, they share only 3 essential terms. Those are the sadhya or the major term, the paksh or the minor term, and the hetu, which is the middle term. So you can see these terms in Nyāya syllogism as well as in Aristotelian syllogism. So they share these 3 terms. But out of the 5 propositions, 2 seem redundant and we can omit either the first 2 or the last 2, as they essentially convey the same information. So the first proposition, it coincides with the 5th, and the second, it coincides with the 4th. So if we exclude the last 2 propositions, the first 3 of Nyāya syllogism, they correspond to the conclusion, the minor term, and the the minor premise and the major premise respectively. So alternatively, if we omit the first 2, the last 3 propositions, they align with the major premise, minor premise, and the conclusion of the Aristotelian syllogism. Therefore, if we leave out the first 2 parts of Nyāya syllogism, we are encompassed by the last 2. So it bears a resemblance basically with the Aristotelian syllogism, and this way we can see or we can relate the Nyāya syllogism with the Aristotelian syllogism. But or hence, if we leave out the first 2 members of the Nyāya syllogism, which are contained in the last 2, we find that it resembles the Aristotelian syllogism in the first figure, and that first figure was AAA with the AAA mood. So it goes as follows, that all things which have smoke have fire. That is your major premise. The second, that this hill has smoke, which becomes your minor premise. And then comes your conclusion. Therefore, this hill has fire. So that becomes the conclusion. Now let us try to understand Aristotelian example from the Nyaya perspective. So here, if we would say that Socrates is mortal, this is your pratigya or the proposition. Why do you say that? Because he is a man. That is the reason or the hetu for you to say that Socrates is mortal. Then you say that whoever is a man is mortal. And you give an example of a person, let's say Pythagoras. And then you try to give an application of these scenarios in this particular case. That Socrates is a man who is invariably a mortal. And then on the basis of these, you then make a conclusion or draw a conclusion that therefore Socrates is mortal, and that is your nigaman or the conclusion. So we have seen that if we want to understand Nyayika's example of smoke and fire from the Aristotelian logic or syllogism, that is also possible in the 3 ways where we show that there is a major premise, there is a minor premise, there is a middle term, and on the basis of that we draw a conclusion, and that is your first figure. And we have also discussed that you can understand Aristotelian example from the Nyayika's perspective by taking the example of Socrates is mortal, because he is a man, and whoever is a man is mortal. The example of this is a person called Pythagoras. Socrates is a man who is invariably a mortal. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. Yet, there are significant distinctions between Nyaya and Aristotle or Aristotelian Syllogism that go beyond just the mere difference in the number of the propositions. Firstly, that the Aristotelian syllogism is purely deductive and it is formal in nature. It relies on the structured and rigid deductive process. In contrast, Nyaya syllogism is deductive-inductive and encompasses both formal and the material aspects. So it combines deductive reasoning and inductive elements as well. So the Nyaya tradition, it correctly recognizes deduction and induction as interconnected and integral part of the same reasoning process. So a perspective that aligns with contemporary Western logic. So inference, according to Nyaya, doesn't simply move from universal to the particular or vice versa. Instead, it moves from the particular to the particular through the universal, and that is where both deduction and induction can be seen interconnected in the Nyaya tradition. So this means that Nyaya acknowledges the role of universal principles in guiding inductive reasoning, where the general truths are inferred from specific instances, or you can say particular instances, and this inductive reasoning then informs the deductive processes where specific conclusions are drawn from general principles. So that is how this process takes place. In the Aristotelian syllogism, the major and the minor terms remain distinct in the premises, connected to each other through the middle term. However, in Nyaya syllogism, all three terms are synthesized within the Upanaya. So if you look at Upanaya, which is the application, you can see it has a synthesis of all these terms together, which is not there in the Aristotelian syllogism. Additionally, the Aristotelian syllogism is characterized by its verbalistic nature, placing a strong emphasis on linguistic structure of the argument. In contrast, the Nyaya tradition acknowledges that the essence of inference does not lie in its verbal form. It rather recognizes that verbal form is primarily a means to persuade or convince the other of the validity of the inference, while in the case of Swartha Anuman, or you can say inference for oneself, this kind of verbalization is not so important or not required at all. So it's only required to persuade or convince the other person about the validity of the inference. Apart from that, Gautama discusses three types of inferences, and those three types of inferences are Purvavat, Sheshavat and Samanito Drisht. The first two are grounded in the concept of causation, that how with the help of causation we draw certain conclusions, while the third is based on the observation of mere coexistence. So let us understand the first one, which is Purvavat inference. This type of inference involves deducing an unperceived effect from the perceived cause. Fine, so here there is an unperceived effect, but there is a perceived cause. So from that, from the perceived cause, we are trying to deduce the unperceived effect here. So in essence, it's the anticipation of a consequence based on the observation of an invariable and unconditional relationship between the cause and its effect. The example that we can take here is of how we predict upcoming rain due to the presence of dark clouds in the sky. So here we cannot really see the rain because that effect is unperceived. It's not yet raining. So the effect is not there in front of us. But we can relate, we can see this connection between the upcoming rain with the dark clouds in the sky. So from that, by seeing the dark clouds in the sky, we can infer that it might rain. So this is known as Purvavat inference. The second is Sheshvat inference. Here it is the reverse of the Purvavat inference. So it entails deducing an unperceived cause from a perceived effect. So it's just the opposite. In the earlier one there was an unperceived effect and a perceived cause, while in this case there is an unperceived cause but there is a perceived effect. So this type of inference, it relies on the principle of invariable and unconditional connection between the cause and the effect. For example, when we infer past rain from the swift, muddy and flooded water of the river, we are here using the Sheshvat inference, because here the cause is unperceived but we can see the effect. So sometimes it happens when you wake up in the morning, you see muddy roads, and from that you deduce that it must have rained the whole night. Fine. So here you cannot really see the cause. You did not actually perceive or see it raining, but you have seen the effect. And from that you are deducing that it must have rained the whole night. The third is Samanita Drisht inference. So unlike the first two, Samanita Drisht inference is not based on causation, but rather on the uniformity of coexistence. So it's not really a cause and effect relation, but you always see or you always observe that there is a uniformity of coexistence of two things. So when you see one, you infer the other. So it doesn't mean that they are causally connected as in the previous two cases, but you see that they always come together. So there is uniformity in their coexistence. So it involves inferring the one characteristic from another, and how? Due to their consistent coexistence. And this type of inference is often linked to the inference by analogy. And the example would be inferring the presence of the cloven hooves in an animal by observing its horns. Since you have seen in the past that these two often come together, or there is often a coexistence of cloven hooves animal having horns. So you often see them together, so you recognize that there is a uniformity in this kind of coexistence. So you infer one from the other, though they are not causally connected to each other. That cloven hooves is not the cause of horns, or horns are not the cause of the cloven hooves, but they are often together, they often coexist, and because of this coexistence, when you see one, you infer the other. According to another interpretation, the Purvavat inference is based on previous experience of universal concomitance between two things, A Sheshavad inference is Parishesh or inference by elimination, and a Samanyata Drisht is inference by analogy. So friends, with this we come to an end of this lecture. We will continue our discussion on Nyaya epistemology in our next lectures. So continue with us and hope to see you in our next lecture. Thank you so much.